Okay, it looks like the number of people signing in has settled down a bit. So I think we're ready to start. So good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. This is the first in our series of webinars on online education, as you probably know, because I think a lot of people have signed up for more than one of them. These are brought to you by a collaboration between EDLAB, the University Library, staff from the Language Centre, and from Faculty of Sciences and Engineering. And I'm Donna from EDLAB, and I'm moderating today's session. So today's speaker is Oscar van den Wijngaard, and you can hopefully see him in one of the little windows as well. He's also working at EDLAB, and he's responsible for research and also policy advising, specifically on the topic of first-year student retention. He's also a former lecturer at the University College Maastricht and a member of the EdView core team. Oscar, can you just say hello so that people can see you on the
Hello,
video?
Good morning, everyone.
Fantastic. Also, what you can see today, if you have your gallery view on, is a panel of experts who are actually the speakers from the other webinars that we've organized this week, and they're going to be helping with the question and answer session, and that's going to follow directly after the formal presentation. We'd also like you to ask your own questions to Oscar and to the panelists, if you'd like to do so. You can do that as the presentation's going on, and you can do that using the little chat mode, which some of you have already found in the Zoom options at the bottom of your screen. We'll keep an eye on the questions that come in during the presentation, but we'll actually answer them after the presentation rather than interrupting the presentation as it goes on. What I'll do now is, because some of you can only see that the person who's talking, is we'll just give the panelists a little chance to say hello so that they get picked up on screen.
Hello, I'm Christina Markanastasakis with the Language Centre. I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar today.
And I am Barend Last from the University Library, working as a blended learning specialist and advising on that. Thank you.
And my name is Stefan Jonge, and I work at the Faculty of Science and Engineering as academic lecturer and coordinator of the teacher professionalization tracks. Welcome, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll hand over to Oscar.
Yep. Thank you, Donna. And good morning, everyone, again. On the first of four webinars, as Donna said, hopefully everyone's sort of getting ready for summer, and we all deserve a break. These have been exciting months. But we all know it's not over. So many of us here are looking at period one or period two, knowing that a lot of planning still needs to happen and a lot of thinking needs to be done. So that's why we offer these four sort of seminars, is really at the threshold of summer. And that's also a little bit this context we're doing this in, sort of looking back at the last few months. We've all been constantly sort of challenged to make decisions, come up with quick solutions about things like assessment, well, things like that was a biggie, but also thinking of our education, sort of the roles that students and tutors play in this new context. And we were confronted with something that has always been there, but now became really sort of explicit, sort of how much do we need to do when we're all together, either virtually or sort of in a real space maybe, but most of us just online. And how much can be done when we're not really together as students and staff. So new words have popped up in our vocabularies, I suppose, for many of us, working synchronously or asynchronously. And that has not been easy. And we had to do it on the fly, where we were sort of trying to deal with how our students were processing the whole crisis, but we're also dealing with it ourselves, let's face it. So that was quite a challenge. So hopefully, there will be a little bit more time now to reflect. And sort of we thought that sort of, you know, there's different sort of ways of doing this. There's individual preferences. Many people get inspired when they read about new opportunities that are there, sort of tools, resources. Others need sort of maybe to step back a little bit and get sort of a basic conceptual idea of what was it again that I was doing. And we're hoping that with this series of four, we're offering both. And sort of for this first one, the perspective I want to take is slightly more from the conceptual perspective. We talk a lot about education at UM. We talk a lot about problem-based learning and CCCS, and also quite often about sort of constructive alignment. For many, I think those theories and ideas are a source of inspiration. Sometimes it may also feel like, oh, I have to do, with all the stuff I'm doing, this also needs to fit into these theoretical paradigms. What I hope that sort of this session and the following sessions will do is really take sort of a positive sort of take on that, which is that taking a step back, looking at it conceptually may really help create space to think about things with still a lot of room sort of for every course coordinator and tutor to give a personal sort of content and approach to that. So constructive alignment and CCCS, sort of the basic concepts, I'll talk more about it later, of our educational sort of philosophy here as a foundation for making all of these different decisions that need to be made about how and when are we using time online. So I want to look at a few main things. And this was advertised as a talk on CCCS, but I'll talk as much about sort of constructive alignment as CCCS. Because I really feel that sort of starting the whole reflective process, thinking again about your intended learning outcomes is so important. So that is the first thing I will talk about. Sort of the second is, okay, what are the consequences of that? How does it help us when we think about assessment? And the third is, how does this help when we think about organizing our teaching and learning activities? So really two theories. Constructive alignment, you're probably all familiar with it. And again, I think a lot of this will be a refresher for many. Constructive alignment, this basic idea that sort of there are three main components in course design. One is the outcomes of a course, what it is that you want students to learn, to acquire, to develop. One that is sort of the teaching and learning activities that you choose, and one that is sort of the assessment that you do. And the idea of constructive alignment is very common sense and basic, which is that these three elements of the triangle really need to sort of correspond with each other. The type of goals you have for learning should be reflected in the type of teaching and learning activities that you have and in the type of sort of assessment that you have. Then it starts to make sense for students. It's easier for them to be engaged. They see why they're doing what they're doing and why they're being assessed the way they are going to be assessed, because they also see, okay, so this is what we're learning and this is how it all relates to each other. A lot more on constructive alignment, by the way, on the constructive alignment webpage that was developed a couple of years ago. The link is in the slides. The other theory, CCCS, this really became sort of a household sort of name since EdView, the research project. Many people already were familiar with these concepts, but you could say that they are really sort of the backbone of our problem-based learning system. And they've been brought to the fore a little bit in the course of EdView, maybe not necessarily replacing the particular application of the 7 steps or the 7 jump, but really reminding us of the fact that there is an origin for that particular educational practice. So those two theories are going to be used. When we go to constructive alignment, as I said, sort of a critical question to ask yourself, and I think a really helpful question is, okay, what again are the intended learning outcomes of my course? And I know that we're being asked nowadays to really make that explicit in our course manuals and in our course environment. So I think for many of us, this in itself should not be a very difficult exercise. It might be useful though to again think, okay, why did I make those my intended learning outcomes again? Was that because it fits into a larger context of a curriculum? Students leaving my course should be able to understand what's happening in the next. Does it have to do with a particular interest that I have? And I sort of was fortunate enough to be given the space to explore that in a course. Where do these come from? And also, what are they really? What is it that we're looking for? So there it might be helpful to make a distinction in types of knowledge. And there are many sort of ways of doing that. One that comes from the theory of constructive alignment, Biggs and Tangs, is a basic, simple one, sort of twofold, distinguishing between declarative and functioning knowledge. So what are those about? I think you've seen these kind of distinctions before. Declarative knowledge, as Biggs says, is really knowledge about things, sort of expressed in a verbal or symbolic form. You might say it's the knowledge that's out there that you need to incorporate, that you need to internalize. It is about the verbs that you see here, about remembering, recognizing, retrieving, classifying. basic stuff that you need many times to move to that other sort of type of knowledge, not necessarily other level of knowledge, but other type of knowledge, which is then sort of described as functioning knowledge. That is the kind of knowledge that informs action by the learner, where they can apply, implement, analyze, hypothesize, create new things. You may sort of recognize this as being quite similar to Bloom's famous taxonomy, where you might argue that sort of what's sort of below the line that I drew there is really sort of what's meant by declarative knowledge, and what's above the line is seen as functioning knowledge. In many ways, you could say that the declarative knowledge really functions to support or be a prerequisite for functioning knowledge. You can have a long discussion about that if that's always true, but I think it makes sense to look at it from that perspective. There's one thing about declarative knowledge, particularly in the current context, that makes it a bit sensitive, though, and that is that it can easily be stolen. It is not something that you have developed and created yourself. It's something that you've internalized from outside, from what you've read in a book, from what you've sort of learned through a lecture. That makes it easier to cheat and steal as well. So even though it is usually very important to have that declarative knowledge, it is a tricky thing when it comes to course design, and particularly assessment. So let's move to assessment. Sort of the two big sort of issues that have been bothering all of us over the last couple of months were, in my view, these: time and authenticity. Time is how much time do I even have available to work on my assessment? But also, where do I invest that time? Does it go into everything that needs to be done to get a certain type of assessment ready to go? Or is it in what needs to be done after assessment, which is really the marking, the grading, the providing of feedback, those kind of things. And this other big one was fraud, plagiarism, authenticity. How do we make sure that when we're not seeing them right in front of us, students do not take advantage of a situation and steal knowledge? By the way, this is also, of course, a particular perspective you may have on students and how and why they learn, but it was a big issue and we had to deal with it. So then when you look at assessment, another famous duo pops up that may be helpful here. That has not to do as much with the type of assessment, but very much with the purpose of assessment. You know the distinction, summative assessment versus formative assessment. You can also speak in sort of the role assessment plays in learning, and there you usually see assessment of, for, and as learning. That more or less sort of aligns with this distinction that is also quite well known, I think. And again, this is not about the format you choose, it's about why you do your assessment. Summative assessment really is an assessment of learning. So here you're actually grading, you're certifying, you're saying yes or no, sufficient or not sufficient, usually with all kinds of consequences for a GPA, for having permission to move on to a next level. So there's a lot at stake here for the student in terms of how they move through the curriculum, through the program. There's also a lot of stake in formative assessment, but in a different way. Formative assessment is really the kind of assessment that's aimed at providing students, in the first place, an insight in how they're doing, in how they're learning, in how they're getting it or not. So that is much more assessment for learning. The stakes are high here as well, because if you do it well, and if students process that information well, it really informs them about themselves. It helps them develop their metacognition, which is one of their main tools as they progress through the program. They need to be allowed to move through, which is usually done on the basis of summative assessment, but they also need to be able to successfully move through the way they're learning, their metacognition, their understanding of how much you understand, which is done through formative assessment. So quite often they may be sort of mixed. A lot of summative assessment usually, hopefully, comes with good feedback, but it's helpful again to make this common sense, often implicit distinction maybe more explicit. Because then we can take a look at how we make choices in forms of assessment, for instance, and how we use our time. Well, here you see a brief overview. It's definitely not exhaustive, but declarative knowledge relevant assessment is usually sort of in the form of a certain type of quiz. Open questions, closed questions, multiple choice questions. It can also be done in oral examination. May not be the most exciting topic for it. Do you know this? Do you remember that? Can you group that together? But you can do it in an oral exam. For functioning knowledge, there are sort of a whole host of opportunities opens up. Some of them can be more time consuming. Of course, when it comes to the grading, to the marking, the papers, presentations, reports, group work. But here again, it is important and helpful to realize that a lot of quizzes can also be developed that really probe into functioning knowledge. The university library has information about that. They work with Test Vision. You can also go straight to Test Vision website and see what's all possible there. The opportunities are broad. It becomes particularly interesting when you start comparing it then, or putting it into this dimension of the purpose of assessment. That helps you think also about how to invest your time. The formative assessment that relies heavily on feedback and possibly peer feedback, but that also needs to be structured and organized. Really, the time goes into that personalized feedback, or really thinking, because that's an option as well, of how you should structure automated feedback that still makes sense, that goes beyond you had this one right and that one wrong, and that's why you get this grade. When it comes to summative assessment, because of the stakes there, a lot of time will need to go into ensuring authenticity. How do we make sure that what students sort of produce or reproduce is really theirs and not someone else's? So there are different types, there are different purposes, there's different types of knowledge, but maybe one thing to be aware of is that one particularly problematic connection is the one between declarative knowledge and summative assessment, because it's declarative knowledge that can be stolen so easily and reproduced where you don't recognize it because it's that same piece of knowledge, right? Sort of in summative assessment really requires this big structure that ensures authenticity and fairness. All of these other options are possible as well. And really, I would encourage you to take a little bit of time to say, okay, now over the summer, to say this time thing that we're always talking about. It is there. I'm not ignoring or denying that it is there, but where can I invest this? How much of this can be put, for instance, in creating a sort of a quiz that goes into functioning knowledge, but particularly with the purpose of formative assessment, but also summative assessment that is sort of more diverse, that really in the functioning knowledge allows for students to use their book, because that's not what it's about. Sort of this third one is an option as well. So when it comes to assessment, think about the type of knowledge you want to assess and the purpose of your assessment, and where you feel that your time that you have, the limited amount of time that you have, is invested best. Then if we switch to teaching and learning activities, the two big questions, as I said, were, okay, what roles do we each perform? Students and particularly tutors. And do we need to do this at the same time, or can we sort of just create a space where students can come in and out and work asynchronously? For that, it may be helpful to look at constructive or at sort of CCCS. CCCS, what are we talking about again? 4 concepts that describe the sort of educational philosophy that supports our teaching at UN. And it does so because we feel that it really enhances the learning, the retention of what is learned, the motivation for what is being learned. And we don't just feel that, but a lot of research has been done into this. So constructive, collaborative, contextual, self-directed. What does that mean? Real quick, I would say constructive really means that knowledge is being generated. It's not adopted from somewhere else. We're generating knowledge. Not necessarily new knowledge to the world, but new knowledge to students. This is not always about making new discoveries for everyone, but sort of seeing knowledge acquisition as a discovery also for the individual student. We're doing that sort of in a way that is contextual. It has meaning, it has relevance. We see how it relates to other things that matter to us. This can be the famous real world examples, but it can also be because it's clear to us how this particular piece of information that we're processing into knowledge really relates to our academic interest. And we're doing it together. We have clear roles. We're not just working on an assignment to get it given to us, but sort of we're self-directed in this. We're creating and discussing our roles and assuming responsibility. A lot more can be said about this, but I would sort of venture to summarize CCCS into this one sentence: generating knowledge that has meaning and relevance together with clear roles and responsibilities. Now, if we think again then of sort of our distinction in two types of knowledge, and again, you can make that much more sort of sophisticated by bringing in Bloom, but let's keep it simple for now. What does that mean for declarative knowledge? What do we expect students to do? There we really want them to explore the content in terms of acquiring it, investigating it, and discussing it. Because even though this is declarative knowledge, it doesn't mean that the only way for students to acquire it is to sit back and listen. Although sometimes this can be very relevant, this can be useful. What is important though, also with declarative knowledge, is that students have the opportunity to discuss, why is this important? Why is this relevant to me? So discussing, investigating, and brainstorming can happen here as well. Just as working together, collaborating in gathering that information, comparing it. So do we get it? That is a sort of a question that cannot just be answered by someone in a teaching role, but also by one student to another. So that means that as a tutor or coordinator of a course, you need to think of certain provisions that you have to offer. So you need to provide that content, but not necessarily always directly. You can also do that by sort of setting the paths for students to find the content, but also by giving a lecture, or in this case, also recording a knowledge clip, by writing your tasks so that they are clear, that they provide that context, that they provide that content, and to encourage by setting particular assignments students to collaborate. When it comes to functioning knowledge, there is even a bigger role for students to take an active lead. There they can investigate and really apply, create new things. The discussion of why is this relevant to us becomes even more important, because it also provides answers to, now what do we feel about this? What do we think about this? How do we apply our knowledge towards something new? So how do we produce something together? And here as well, there is an important role, even though it may be student-led, but for coordinators and tutors, because there needs to be an infrastructure. And you can choose to be sort of more open about that and leave even part of the infrastructure to students. But you can also just feel that, okay, I'll provide the infrastructure like a playground for the students to work in, and I'm there to provide feedback. And again, I can provide input as well through lectures or otherwise, and in the tasks even that I'm writing. And I encourage and create a structure even more where students can discuss this relevant, where students can set goals for themselves. So for both types of knowledge, there are clear roles that students can perform independently at this, working together at the same time, or gathering and storing information asynchronously. But that doesn't mean that there isn't work that needs to be done by the coordinator of a course and the tutor of a course. And sort of in our next webinar, I think we'll hear a lot more about the tools, maybe from a coordinator perspective, but further down the line, we'll also talk more about the role of the tutor. What it really comes down to, sort of wrapping this up, is that, again, I think it is useful, even if you're very familiar with these theories, and even if you have very explicit ILOs, to sort of walk through that process once more, to really reflect again on where did these intended learning outcomes come from again? Why did I choose to use them? And how did that lead to the assessment that I used so far? May a sort of review of my intended learning outcomes may also lead to new opportunities, not to be fancy, but sort of really to create breathing space, new opportunities, different types of assessment, and different types of using all the resources that are there to engage the students, to engage my tutors, to create an environment in which this can work. So here I've listed a few obvious websites, and maybe to end this before we open it up for question, one other important thing, sort of Donna mentioned that sort of I've also been working on this sort of student retention project for a while now. A third theory that I decided not to bring into all of this is that of student engagement. But we have seen, we have felt ourselves and with our students how important it is to keep those connections, to keep engaged, to stay engaged. So I would also encourage you to, when you think about what you can do on campus, to really think of activities that sort of facilitate that part. Because we've also seen, fortunately, we've learned so much in so little time that a lot can be done online in effective working, synchronously, synchronously. But this piece of the personal connection and motivation is the tough one, maybe to focus on when we have time sort of on campus. And that sort of wraps up sort of the talk. And I would be happy, Donna, to open it up for questions and also members of the panel.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Oscar. So for the participants who are watching, please pitch any of your questions via the chat. We also have the opportunity to allow you to participate via audio. So if you pitch a question by chat, we can come back to you with the audio section. But for now, I'm going to go straight to the panelists and ask if they have any questions to follow up on this. Panelists, Barend.
Yeah, I got a first question. I'm very intrigued by aligning these three elements constructively. And I was wondering, can you provide us with an example of what happens and how it looks like when a course and these three elements are disaligned, constructively disaligned? How does that look in practice?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, there is a clear example that is often given, but I think it's a real good one. I mean, in our context, when we do PBL, we create sort of an environment in which we say it's important for students to discuss, to set their own learning goals. And I think everyone understands that that happens within a certain bandwidth, because we're giving a course with certain intended outcomes. But the idea really is that there is a voice for students there to also say, okay, we look at a particular problem like this, and we feel that to enhance our understanding, these are a few important learning goals that we have. It may, though, happen that at the end of the course, there is sort of a form of assessment which really sort of is all based on, for instance, a textbook that accompanied that course. So, and it is understandable that part of the intended learning outcome may be that students are just familiar with the context of the book. But if you're saying, students, here you are, we do problem-based learning. It's important that you participate, which is also why in many places we make that mandatory, that you contribute, that you decide on the direction that this course is taking. And then at the end of the course, you're saying, okay, but basically now we're asking questions based on the book. Once that gets out, clearly you will understand that students will think, okay, what's the purpose of us getting together? Are we putting up a little show and going through the motions? Or are we really sort of co-authors of our learning, which is also reflected in the way we're being assessed? So it is an old example, but I think it's a very sort of powerful example of how disalignment may really demotivate and disengage students.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Barend, did that answer your question, or do you have a follow-up?
No, it's a good example of what can happen. Maybe I can add on that a little bit. From my own practice, I've seen some disalignment as well, where a teacher came up to me and asked me, well, I'm doing this paper and I'm doing an end of course open exam. And the paper addressed different ILOs than the exam did. And during the lectures that the teacher did, she only addressed the knowledge that was necessary for the open exam. So she saw a huge drop in difficulties and students saying, I don't get why we have to do this paper. So I asked her, so what do you do in that paper? And she said, well, that's just the basic knowledge. That's everything they need to know. That's basic. That's not what I'm going to address in the lectures. That's something they have to prepare themselves. But by doing that, the students failed to recognize the relationship between the knowledge that was more in depth and the basic knowledge and skills that they needed to do that. So I felt that was a good example of disalignment as well. And I told her, like, okay, but make sure that during these lectures and during your activities and during your working tutorial groups, you also address why this basic knowledge is important and why that is reflected in the paper and how that connects to the overall aim of your course. Just a small example I could add on that.
Absolutely. I think the expectation management with the students is really essential. Otherwise, yeah, you do demotivate them, especially when you have misalignment. Yeah, we also have a question through the chat, and this is from Berson, and she asks, she asks just if you could clarify, Oscar, what you mean by automated feedback.
Well, you can, of course, the more open-ended the questions are that you present students with, the harder it will be for any time of automated process to provide feedback. But for instance, when you think of functioning knowledge can be also tested in the form of various options of outcomes of a thought process. So the question may be asking about a certain application of knowledge, going towards a set of answers where one is a much more appropriate application of that sort of knowledge than another. Sort of based on the outcome of those kind of questions, if for instance, a student sort of tilts towards a certain type, so this is where time goes into the preparation of the test, because you really have to think about what are the options that I give students to answer. And there may be sort of answers that go more towards a superficial repetition of what was learned, and others that go in their nature more towards an active application and a coherent application. So a program can sort of look at the type of answers you select, even if it's a closed-ended multiple choice type of test, and deduce from that some general observations about the preferences that are suggested by your choices. Clearly, this is sort of far less sort of sophisticated than the feedback that you might receive on a paper, but it is more than just, okay, we've tallied the right and wrongs, and the outcome is a 6.7. And now you do with that information whatever you want.
Can I add on that a little bit, Oscar?
Sure.
It's to make it very explicit. We now are going to work with Canvas in the upcoming months, and in the new year we've transitioned to that. And in Canvas, for example, you can create quizzes, and in these quizzes, students get this in an assignment. And with every quiz answer, it has multiple question types. You can choose in every answer the student picks what the feedback will be if they've chosen that answer. And if this is the correct answer, it might be, yes, this is correct. And you can read more and more on that here. And if it's the incorrect answer, you can say, this was not correct. Make sure to go back to this article, or make sure to redo this assignment and check that again. And that is very much what automated feedback within a system, a learning management system, can look like. But next to that, there's also, of course, feedback that doesn't just come from automated systems, but you have feedback from the teacher, you have feedback from peers, and you have feedback from the assignment or the content itself. And within a system like Canvas or plugins that we use, we can also automate a lot of that whole process. For example, using a peer feedback tool, you can let students provide feedback on each other's products or on each other's competencies, and all you have to do is set this up before the course starts, and the system takes care of the rest. So you create multiple feedback moments where students get feedback not only from you as a teacher or course coordinator or tutor, but also from the peers and from the assignment itself.
Yeah, I think that's so essential, because a lot of people feel overwhelmed if they have big student numbers, and they feel like as a tutor or as a course coordinator, you are the sole person responsible for giving feedback. And actually, there are a lot of mechanisms where you can get students to self-direct or to give each other peer feedback. I also used to use a lot of online assessment for mathematics, and it was graded automatically, and the students got a green if they got it right and a red if they got it wrong. And if they got it wrong, they knew that they had to go back and re-study and relearn that topic. So they were able to identify their own weaknesses, and that's how you can help them move forward. We also have another question from the group, and that's from Wijngaard, and he asks if there are examples of knowledge where the declarative and the functioning overlap, Oscar.
Yeah, I think he asked a question to all panelists, by the way, but sort of I'm happy to take a first step. Yeah, I mean, this is one of those moments where immediately you have to say that, of course, every distinction, particularly a binary, in something as elusive as knowledge is fairly artificial. So yes, it is difficult to say in many cases, well, this is purely declarative knowledge, that is purely functioning knowledge. So sort of my own background is in history and philosophy. are years and dates sort of declarative knowledge or functioning knowledge? Well, sort of maybe if I just ask sort of the set of questions, when did World War II happen? When was the Maastricht Treaty? And I expect a number of years, an answer that looks very much like declarative knowledge. If my question goes towards explaining a certain contemporary phenomenon on the basis of historical events, then to have those events in the right order might still be a form of declarative knowledge, but it becomes also very much part of my functioning knowledge. So it's hard to make that distinction. And that, I think, is also why it is so useful to, when you look at your own intended learning outcomes, to really think back again and say, what is it eventually that I want students to be able to do? And what is it that they need to know for that? And you will probably find a lot of declarative knowledge in that. Sort of, for many years, I coordinated a course on contemporary world history at UCM. And really, and I have to admit, I wasn't thinking in terms of intended learning outcomes as explicitly as I just suggested everyone should do when I created that course. But a lot of what I've sort of hoped students would come away with would be functioning knowledge. But I also felt somehow, as some kind of flawed historian, that it would be useful for them to know that sort of World War I was sort of after the Great Crisis, things like that. Sort of, but I moved away gradually from asking questions that were just about, when did this happen? When did that happen? Because I saw that in order to ask my more answer my more interpretative questions, students would have to know that anyways. And I was assuming that gradually they began to see that too, so that they were sort of organizing their more declarative knowledge, really, as I suggested also, as a foundation, as a prerequisite for the functioning knowledge. Does it answer your question? Or other panelists?
Yeah, other panelists, do you have any follow-up?
Yeah, maybe I can follow up into that. I think that it's very important indeed to get back to that constructive alignment and also taking the Bloom's taxonomy into account, so that when you want to measure that declarative and you have your intended learning outcome focusing on remembering and understanding, I think, for example, for a summative assessment, that would really be able to have like follow-up questions to that. So you start with A and B questions with the declarative and having your taxonomy related to remembering and understanding, and then maybe going on to more like difficult questions and going to like higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, in which you try to apply and synthesize and create, for example, information. So I think it also helps in making the distinction for designing the intended learning outcomes and how to assess them.
Can I ask another question? I was wondering, Oscar, in your presentation, you approached the three elements from intended learning outcomes and then assessment and then teaching and learning activities. Would that also be your suggested approach when you approach course design? First do your intended learning outcomes, then your assessment, and then your TLAs? Or is that arbitrary?
Well, it's not entirely arbitrary, but I wouldn't say that that needs to be the order. Also, because of what I said sort of way at the beginning, I know, and I sort of if I take myself as sort of an example, and is one, but I know that sometimes I can be very inspired by something that I read about a learning activity. And as a matter of fact, sort of working with many people on getting information together during the last couple of months has exposed me to a lot of sort of techniques and methods that I wasn't familiar with. And it excited me. I thought, oh, I want to try this. So the inspiration for thinking about a potential new course design really came from the activities. At the end of the day, though, I think it is really good to have many things revolve about those intended learning outcomes. Also because we're not creating our courses in splendid isolation. And I think the way we're talking about it may already sort of suggest too much that, yes, there is a program, but otherwise I can do what I want. I think for the reality for many course coordinators is that they find themselves in a very clear spot in a curriculum where they have students, for instance, coming in from courses that preceded their course, and they know they will sort of continue on to courses after this. And it's expected of me that I make sure that these students have acquired the knowledge that they need to be successful sort of later on. So in that sense, I think I would personally have sort of a logical preference for putting those ILOs in the middle. But that doesn't mean that sort of one of the other two parts of constructive alignment cannot be sort of truly powerful sources of inspiration when you're in the process of redesigning your course. So yes and no, in a way.
And a follow-up question for Stefan, based on this. I know that you wrote a blog about how you changed your course in the Corona times. How did you approach this when going back to your intended learning outcomes and seeing if you needed to do some changes that affected the TLAs and the assessment?
Yeah, so I think that one indeed very interesting observation was indeed that we had this very emergent switch to online education. So the first thing that I really did is to have a look at the intended learning outcomes and see if I could actually meet those intended learning outcomes in a different way with different kind of teaching and learning activities. And actually, like, one intended learning outcome was really for students to acquire data in the lab. So that was of course not possible. So we had to really rethink that ILO and say, okay, that is just not possible because of the COVID restrictions. So we had to rethink that, and we came up with that they will actually did thought experiments. So we let them reflect on the experiment, and we gave them information about the actual experiment. But in the end, we gave them the data which they actually would collect in the lab, and then they would do still the similar data analysis. Then still there is, of course, did that meet the first intended outcome? No, it did not. It was not like it did not meet the first initial intended outcome, but it did meet the adjusted intended learning outcome. And then for the other ILOs within the course, we could actually overcome that with having knowledge clips available. So we changed the online lectures a bit, so we didn't have the full 2 hours synchronous lectures, but we provided them with knowledge clips. We provided them with online tutorials in which they would discuss with the tutor, and they would actually be able to meet and acquire the skills which were part of the intended outcomes of the course.
Thanks.
Yeah. I think it's fair to say, yeah, the online education was new for the majority of us here, but actually our colleague Christina, she's had quite a few years of experience in developing and designing online education, so it'd be interesting hearing your view as well.
Well, with self-directed, student-centered online learning, it's very important to remember that it's very process-orientated. I mean, one thing I was going to ask, Oscar, is if in your view, I mean, in my personal perspective, is the emphasis, increasing emphasis that will be placed on formative assessment, because and I see a question here in the chat box in relation to professional development and short programs and added value to assessment. I would say with online education and in terms of also bringing into it Bloom's taxonomy, there's going to be a shift away from remembering and a greater sort of emphasis on taking large amounts of information and synthesizing it, and assessment processes, especially formative assessment processes in which students or participants in a course need to demonstrate their knowledge via a process which is not just a one-off, but it's an ongoing sort of a process which can be co-created, and also there could be peer feedback within that. There could be then feedback from an instructor or a teacher. And then once again, because obviously taking that into account, integrating it, and then improving one's work on the basis of that, really, especially in the current era where so much information needs to be dealt with, is really, I think, going to be the new emphasis rather than any kind of final test or exam. And that's how things will line up in the end. I have colleagues in Australia who work at Adelaide University, and they have already told me that assessment processes have become such that the final is only worth 30%. It's the 70% is actually what goes on in the process, which is overseen by an instructor or teacher, depending on the course. And then the final is just like the cherry on the pie, really. It's just to, say, yes, you went through that process. So I really believe that the formative, and, in order to sort of encompass the affordances of online learning, the formative assessment, and which is far more student-centered and allows students to sort of, I guess, use their judgment and integrate their own knowledge into the process, is probably what's going to be emphasized in the upcoming period.
Yeah, I'll just add on there, because the question was also, it was about, yeah, what do you do if there is no formal assessment? Specifically, I guess this is less relevant for our bachelor's programs and things like that, but in professional education, where, for instance, in continuing professional development, where members of staff take a course and it's a short course, well, we often don't formally assess that or summatively assess that at the end. But I guess the assessment it's very much linked with contextual learning, right? Because we're trying to make the learning that's taking place very relevant to your work environment and to the skills that you need to perform in your daily work. And your assessment is, instead of taking place in a formal manner, actually that's part of the transfer of your learning to what it is that you're doing in daily practice. And also the impact that might have on your organization or within your team. So it's kind of being measured informally. So if somebody takes a short course and then you can see that their skills have been improved, then perhaps those are things that get discussed in your appraisals, for instance, or you can glean information from that from the organizational statistics. So it's a slightly different topic, I think, but interesting nonetheless. Are there more questions from the panelists or views that you want to raise? Stefan.
I had one question, maybe that's the elephant in the room, but the online proctoring really causes quite some discussions within the faculties. And I was just wondering about your opinions about whether to use online proctoring, yes or no, whether it's feasible, whether we should overcome that in a different way on dealing with assessment.
Well, I think the proctoring issue, but this is just me sort of giving my personal perspective on it, but really sort of relates strongly to this one red arrow that I drew between declarative knowledge and summative assessment. Because that indeed sort of is the delicate situation where you know, where your chosen perspective on knowledge is that it's something that can be stolen, and that sort of the participants in the testing will have no other stake than to score as highly as possible, and will do anything they can to get there. So there's a whole lot of stuff wrapped up in there. It's your idea about what is important for students to learn, and your idea about what motivates students to learn. And I'm not saying that those ideas are necessarily 100% wrong, but sort of together they form this sort of situation where indeed you want to have eyes on the students, even though they're not there, in all kinds of ways. Creating, I think, a culture of assessment that is, in my personal view, quite the opposite from what we say we value about education. I think anyone in education, but particularly in Maastricht, which is not to say that I don't think that no student will ever be inclined to say, what did she write down, or something. I mean, but this is more about basic assumptions about student motivation. So that's why I also urged sort of, and I don't think it's entirely unrealistic to say, take a little bit of time to reflect on why you assess and how you assess, because if you feel that the way to go is proctoring, you will be spending a lot of time on making that work too. So it's not like that is the quick solution, and any alternative will take you a huge amount of time.
And next to that, Oscar, proctoring is not the same as doing an exam in the MEC with 800 other students. The feedback that we get from students is it's very stressful to sit in a room with nobody present, but a big brother is watching you. Yeah. And that effect on how you feel motivation and how you do the test under this pressure, I think might negatively affect the results as well. So it's not the same as doing a physical exam. So let alone the content is different, that is also different.
Maybe if I may, because I see one question in the chat by Alvaro that sort of, and we only have a few minutes left, and we can and should talk about that question for a long time. Sort of the struggle between sort of the perceived or actual reality that summative assessment and grades in the end is what counts, and the genuine desire you may have in a teaching role to do formative assessment, to provide your students with feedback. because that is, I think, sort of the delicate reality that we're all in. Sort of, if we want to sort of inspire our students and we want to create wonderful modules that get our students very motivated, and we see that even in those students who sort of express this motivation and engagement during the course, there may be a point where that flips and the question is just, why didn't I get an 8.5 instead of an 8? Because I needed to get into that program. Disconnecting at that point sort of the result with the learning process in a way. The only thing that matters now is not sort of my made-up cognitive development as a student, but the grade I receive. There is no short answer to that. Sort of, I think, sort of where summative and formative sort of meet is in proper feedback on assignments that are also used for summative assessment. And that is definitely, and I know this has been said many times before as well, but definitely a good place to start, because then at least you're allowing students and encouraging them to keep making that connection between how they learn and how they study and what rewards they receive. Because I agree with Christina that ideally sort of, and maybe in certain places, sort of really concretely, there is a move towards formative assessment, but you know, I've been at UCM, and UCM is a place in many ways like any other, but one thing I never had to complain about is the motivation of students. But there as well, at the end of the day, what mattered a lot to many of them, and understandably, were the grades they received. Because here were sort of the motivated students who want to move on to sort of very prestigious master's programs that the bar high. And all of a sudden, it seemed that all this intrinsic motivation and dedication was gone because all that matters are grades. That is clearly something we cannot solve at course level or not even at an institutional level. So the constant challenge is to say, okay, despite all of this, because our fun in teaching is not in giving grades either. Sort of despite all of this, how can we bring these formative and engaging sort of aspects into our course as much as possible and make students see how things relate, why at the end of the day they had that grade, not as something that came out of nowhere, but that is a reflection on how they have been organizing their learning. It's not satisfactory, but I hope that sort of we can have sort of as a teaching community, many conversations about this in the future, because it's a critical question.
And these decisions, I think, for the shift toward formative assessment, they do have to be made in some way from the top down at the faculty level, at the top of the university. What I noticed at another university where I worked, this shift toward formative assessment was actually very effective also with dealing with plagiarism, because it was no longer about simply reciting or remembering or knowing enough to just restate whatever source it was that one had read during in the course of one's studies. One had to comment, the students had to comment on it, right? And had to write, you know, quite an extensive sort of critical evaluation of the actual source. And it was a weekly process, which, you know, was very effective. And in the end, the 2 best out of 7 were chosen. And this was a great way to make it a process. It was formative until it was summative. So there was a nice blend in sort of intermingling of the 2 types of assessment. But of course, this was decided at the top, right, by the people sort of making decisions for the entire department. So I guess that's something that would need to be taken into account.
I think it's something that the university is looking quite heavily into at the moment, in perhaps taking a move towards programmatic assessment, where students will have more coaching and fewer, or in fact maybe no summative exams, and they would work on developing their competencies and then being able to demonstrate when they feel they've achieved that competence, and being able to demonstrate that to a mentor who can then basically sign them off on that particular trajectory. So I think it'll be interesting times in the coming couple of years. We also have, and I think it will be our final question for today, with an eye on the time, but a question over whether there are good platforms to assess in a formative way. And I know the library have their tool wheel, so I think you can look up a lot of information there. And Barend has also mentioned some really nice examples, such as feedback fruits for peer assessment. But Barend, do you have anything else you want to add on this topic?
Yes, please come to my webinar tomorrow. I'm going to be talking about platforms and tools, but of course I have to say, from an educational perspective, start with the method, and then the tool will follow. So peer feedback is a method, and next to that, for instance, diaries are a method. Let students do a blog, reflect on that, and let students reflect on themselves, and teachers reflect on themselves as well. And this can be done in our learning management system, Canvas. So Canvas is the good platform we have to assess in a formative way. And in that system, we can apply a huge amount of different methods to reach this formative assessment. And of course, we have some specific tools like Feedback Fruits. We have WooClap, we have Qualtrics. And these are tools that really aim to address one specific method or a couple of them. And I will go a little bit more in depth about that tomorrow. But think more of how can I build in several points of feedback during the running time of any course, and then go back to the intended learning outcomes and see how can we already address these and provide feedback for the students so they can redirect their journey towards the end of the course. So come tomorrow and check out the webinar, and I'll tell you more about it.
Fantastic, and I think that's a really good point to end on. So there are still spaces available. It's still possible to register for all of the upcoming webinars this week. So we hope to see you tomorrow, if not later in the week. Thank you very much. I think we'll wrap up, and I'll ask the panelists just to stay behind a little bit once everyone's signed out. Thank you very much for attending.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
All right.